Welcome everyone, my name is Cody Scott, and in this video, we review the Canon Macro 100mm 2.8. My friends, my family, and everyone else in between, welcome to a channel that teaches you how to explore, inspire, and engage as an active videographer. My name is Cody Scott, and if you're new to this channel, feel free to consider hitting that subscribe button, that like button, or that dislike button to keep content coming to you. In this video, we're going to review the characteristics of the Canon 100mm 2.8 macro lens. Our 5 topics that we'll discuss is chromatic aberration, spherical distortion, optical distortion, sharpness, and bokeh. Before we jump into these characteristics, you must understand the way that light passes through a lens. As light passes through a lens, it starts to bend and then hits your sensor or film camera. And as it's passing through there's a lot of things happening as it hits each piece of glass. That makes up the characteristics of the elements we are going to talk about today. And before we jump into it, I have to say that I'm not getting paid to say any of this, and I'm not being sponsored by Canon to talk about this lens. And the last piece of information to understand is the more expensive a lens is, the more elements are included in the lens to compensate for some of these inconsistencies. You don't just remove them from a lens, you add more glass to balance the lens out. So the more expensive a lens is, it's because it has more glass in it to help balance and improve some of these inconsistencies we're going to talk about today, starting with sharpness. Now, this lens is a fairly sharp lens. It's a 2.8, so it's going to retain that sharpness close up. From a distance, it does start to get a little bit soft though. Around a 2.8, it's pretty soft. But when you shoot around a 5.6, then you are golden. This lens is a monster at a 5.6 aperture. So on a scale from 0 to 5, 0 being soft, 5 being sharp, then I'm going to give it a 4. It could be a 4.5, but just to be safe, I'm going to give it a 4 because it is sharp at higher apertures or lower apertures, whatever you understand. When you get down to a 2.8, it starts to get a little soft, but that's to be expected with a macro lens. 2, spherical distortion. Now, when light passes through a lens, it starts to bend, and as it hits that focusing point might land behind the sensor, in front of the sensor, or right on the sensor. And when you see that, you will start to notice a ghostly glow happening with spherical distortion. And that can be a creative thing if you'd like, but that is called spherical distortion. Now, on a scale from 0 to 5, 0 being none at all, 5 being terrible, I'm going to give this lens a 2. It could be a 2.5 and maybe even a 3, because when light passes through this thing, oftentimes I see that glow happening with this lens. However, as I mentioned, it can be solved by putting a hood on your camera, putting it at around a 5.6 aperture, and just letting in enough light. So that's why I'm giving it the score that I gave it. Moving on to topic number 3, chromatic aberration. Now, chromatic aberration is the instance when light passes through a lens, it's sending in red, green, and blue wavelengths. After going through the lens and it hits the sensor, there might be more red, more green, more blue channels hitting that sensor. That's going to cause chromatic aberration. You can see this typically in the highlights of windows with a low dynamic range camera, as well as the edge of a tree line. If you start to change some of the skies, the colors and the hues and the luminance, then you can start to see it happening in that. It's also very evident around the edges of bokeh. On a scale of 0 to 5, 0 being none at all, 5 being terrible, I'm going to give this lens a 3. I do see some chromatic aberration happening in my bokeh, and because this compresses the image quite a bit because it's a macro lens, you will see some noticeable chromatic aberration. Next, we're going to go to bokeh. And bokeh is the blurriness that you see in the background right now, as well as those tiny little circles of light that you see when you're shooting in light situations where there's a flashlight or something in the background that's not focused on. You guys know this, and it's a beautiful characteristic of a lens. Now, this thing does compress the background quite a bit because it's a macro lens. So on a scale of 0 to 5, 0 being terrible, 5 being awesome at bokeh, I'm going to give this a 4. There's some beautiful bokeh, but I've seen better. So in comparison to this lens with its price point, it's going to get a 4. And I might even change that to a 3.5, 4. instead of the upper swing, because I've seen better. And moving on to the final topic, which is optical distortion. You typically see this on a wide angle lens or a super narrow lens like a 100 millimeter. You're either stretching out or you're doing this pin cushion kind of shape. You start to see this on the edge of the lens or the center of the lens. In this case, it would be towards the center where it starts to push in. Now you can see a lot of this optical distortion if you were able to look at a wide angle and a 100 millimeter lens. A 100 millimeter is terrible for the face because it just punches in way too much and it starts to push in on someone's face and it makes someone look fat. So if I was shooting on a 100 millimeter and I shot someone's face on a wedding or whatever, they would look fat with this lens. So in terms of optical distortion on a scale of 0 to 5, 0 being terrible, 5 being the best at it, I'm going to give this a 3.5, maybe even a 4, because 100 millimeter is terrible for the face, and for this lens, I do notice a lot of optical distortion. If you'd like to purchase this lens, there's gonna be a link down in the description. Well, that's all for me, guys. So if you found this video helpful and you'd like to learn more, please click that subscribe button, that like button, or that dislike button if you choose, so I can continue to bring you guys content like this. I'll see you guys in the next one.